Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Grossman, Associate General Counsel at the Investment Advisor Association. I'd like to introduce our experienced panelists. We have Lee Faria, who's the Vice President of Asset Management Compliance and the CCO for Columbia Management Investment Advisors in Boston. Chris Hayes, who's the CCO and a principal at 1919 Investment Council in Baltimore. And Jen Klass, who's a partner and co-chair of Baker McKenzie's Financial Regulation and Enforcement Practice in North America, based in the New York office. So thank you, Lee, Chris, and Jen, for being on this panel. Now that it's been almost a full year since COVID started and most firms have been operating remotely, we wanted to look back on the compliance challenges that advisors have faced and talk about how the work environment has changed, but also reflect on lessons learned that advisors can carry forward in the future, because there have definitely been some silver linings. So let's rewind to about a year ago and talk about your experiences when this first started and when you went from feeling like every day was an emergency to transitioning to some type of new normal. And we'll start with you, Lee.
Sure, thanks, Laura. I guess if I look back, it probably happened mid to late May, where I started to sort of feel like people were transitioning. It was less hectic, although still hectic, but I think people were starting to adjust. And I also think that the market volatility was starting to level off a little bit at that time. Fortunately, I think like a lot of firms, we were, well positioned in terms of our BCP and our remote operations. They worked really effectively. We had new technology that was rolled out that made it a lot easier for people to connect with colleagues virtually. So as I said, after the first few months, sort of some of the novelty was really wearing off. When I think about that time, it was also close to when we were sort of preparing for our annual compliance training. And while we were starting to sort of look at things and say, okay, it's been about 2 months, how long is it going to be? It seemed like it was going to be longer, but it was just so much uncertainty about how long it was going to be. But we were planning our annual compliance training and trying to weave in, those topics that we thought were particularly relevant to reinforce as part of the annual compliance training, those policies that are particularly sensitive, including temporary modifications to policies that we had adopted. And again, we were really wrestling with how much to focus on those points because we weren't sure, would we still be in this sort of work from home environment at the time of our annual compliance training. And as it turned out, we were. So that was kind of how things were going at about that time for my firm.
Great. And let me bring you into the conversation, Chris. What are some of the challenges that you faced at the very beginning, and how did your transition go for you from going back to a new normal? You lost Chris. Okay, so Chris will come back. But Jen, how about you? You have the perspective of many different clients. What are some of the trends you thought you saw in terms of challenges that firms were facing across all sizes?
There was a couple of stages of acceptance with respect to the changes as a result of COVID. I think many firms started implementing their business continuity and contingency planning plans in the very beginning of COVID. Those plans are really based on sort of regionalized issues that are time limited. And so I think we all went into this with a mindset of sort of, this is a hurricane that will pass. And then at some point we realized it really wasn't, and it was a much longer term issue. And so I think we went through the stage of sort of understanding that it was going to be a longer term issue in terms of changing policies and procedures and the way that firms operate and moving to the work from home environment. sort of as a first stage. And now I think we're starting to think about what this is really going to mean long term going forward, in terms of what are the permanent changes that are going to result from this global pandemic.
And Jen, have you seen a difference in the challenges faced by larger versus smaller firms?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in some respects, it's the same story, that larger firms had more resources to address these sorts of situations and some of the challenges that investment advisors were confronting. By the same token, smaller firms could be far more nimble and address some of the challenges quicker, just because there was less to coordinate. And so I think it was really, a mixed bag in terms of pros and cons.
Okay, so while we're waiting for Chris to reconnect, why don't we talk about some of the key changes that advisors have had to make to their compliance programs as a result of COVID. And some of these might be things you keep permanently, whereas others might be things you just had temporarily during this period. So Jen, do you want to start?
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think that obviously, the key change was the migration to a work from home environment for almost all firms. And there are many compliance issues that flowed from that. I think the three key ones that we'll talk about throughout the course of our panel are sort of the focus on information security and cybersecurity. We've heard that consistently from OC, and we heard it again from Pete Driscoll today. I can't get my head around saying exams instead of OC, so I'm just going to keep referring to it as OC. State licensing and registration issues we'll talk about, and the impact that a work from home migration had there. And then, of course, sort of remote supervision and client connections. I think that one of the other things that's really important to focus on is there is a distinction between making changes to programs and practices and making changes to policies and procedures. And I worry that a lot of firms, made the changes they needed to confront the existing issues through COVID, but they haven't actually updated policies and procedures to reflect those changes and sort of gone back through. There effectively has been a fundamental business shift for most every investment advisor. And I think it would be helpful for firms, if they haven't already gone through the exercise, to revisit their policies and procedures and update them from that perspective. And also take that into consideration in doing the annual compliance reviews under 2647.
Thanks, Jen.
Yeah,
so Chris is with us. Chris, let me ask you to just talk about some of the challenges that you've seen at your firm, and how any differences you can point to in terms of a smaller firm versus a larger firm grappling with these things.
Sure, it's big also geographically. So we have about 17 billion under management. We're small, but we have 7 or 8 different locations, offices that we've sort of integrated over the years, which have some of their own characteristics. So really making sure we keep those groups and offices, and some of them are almost unique strategies. The San Francisco office does one particular thing. They're a group. They've been together for 15 years on their own, but 2 years with us. So one of the challenges is just keeping yourself in touch, keeping yourself even optical to those offices. I think we talked later on about being proactive. To me, that has been the biggest thing, is sort of pushing yourself in, whether that's update on rule changes, just forwarding the SEC recent risk audit, getting out there and being proactive is key. It will force us to re-examine our model of, going to these offices once or twice a year. Now, I think we're going to go back to travel at some point, but in a way, it's a good inflection point to how do we manage these offices? How do we manage these relationships? We're going to have to be much more nimble, less paper intensive. I describe it to some degree as more self-help within staff, within offices. So it's obviously been a rough year for all of us. but I see possibly good things coming out of this in a year, 3 years, 5 years, where, we will be more nimble and able to provide oversight without the old school coming in the office, walking around, which in reality is no better than going into a set of files and setting up a call.
And I imagine you also had the challenge with different locations of just even keeping track of the various state laws in terms of reopenings and restrictions. So that was unique.
By far, one of the biggest challenges we've had is distinct offices, either on their own or by local, rules, and taking their own steps, making sure they're not, we have 100, let's say 30 employees, they all need to be treated the same, so we've had to, I wouldn't go so far as to say police that, but encourage that, even though Birmingham, Alabama is open, we have an office there. That doesn't mean, that doesn't mean you should be going in that direction. Another issue is we are owned by Stifel Bank. So we also have bank issues, reporting up through the bank, risk, audit, legal. And it's been very interesting. We have fast movers, slow movers. That may be by choice, that may be by regulation. So it's been a challenging environment.
Wow. I just want to pause here and give out the first code word. It's COVID, COVID. That's your first word. And we have gotten a couple of audience questions that I'd like to address. The first one, I think we should address to Jen. Should BCPs include pandemic-specific plans? Jen, is that something you see clients having?
Yeah, I don't know that they necessarily have to call it or have a pandemic-specific plan, but I think they need to be reevaluated to consider a global incident that is not sort of geographically limited or time limited. And so, if that takes you to a pandemic or to other types of events, which I don't even want to try to think about, I think those are some of the types of considerations that need to be built into BCP plans.
And so I think a related question has to do with disclosure in Form ADV. We got a question the other day whether people are talking about pandemics in their ADVs. And an audience member is asking another ADV disclosure question, which is whether Paycheck Protection Program loans that firms may have taken during this period need to be or should be disclosed in your brochure. So I'll go back to you, Jen, for these legal type questions.
Yeah, I think that there's a materiality determination that needs to be made with respect to the PPP loans and how the firms are using them. I will tell you, in the vast majority of cases, investment advisors are disclosing the receipt of the PPP loan and how they've used it in the context of their advisory business. I do think, and Pete Driscoll mentioned this in the earlier session, there's also a disclosure issue around item 18 in terms of whether the firm is, in financial distress or in a position in which it can't fulfill its contractual or regulatory obligations. And if that's the case, then independent of PPP, firms need to consider disclosing that.
Thanks, Jen. Lee, did you want to comment on BCPs or anything else related to compliance programs?
Well, I guess I would just reinforce the comments that Jennifer made about the policies and procedures. I think, taking the time now to look back and revisit your policy and procedures again. In our situation, there were definitely things that we adjusted, and we may have issued, for example, compliance advisory saying, for the time being, you can do X or Y, and that's still consistent with our policies and procedures. But going back now and making sure that you make those updates to the policies and procedures, particularly since now it's been a longer period of time, or if you're going to be adopting that now sort of as a permanent state, and it's really a good time to also sort of look across at all of your other disclosures. Jennifer was talking about the Form ADV. So is this something that you also need to modify disclosures that you make to clients either through your Form ADV or responding to questionnaires and requests for proposals. I think that that's, really an important thing to do. And I would imagine, at a minimum, people would have had changes, probably with respect to supervision and monitoring, but also with respect to, record keeping, as we were talking about. And oversight of electronic communications is just another area that was probably, revised during the course of the time, and you may need to look at those policies and procedures as well.
Yeah, we've looked at it's interesting that you described letting some things be a little more relaxed. We've done a little of that, but we've also found things that just don't work as well remotely and have chosen to pull back on them. Again, we have let's say a personal trading policy where some of it was self-help if you're under a certain amount of shares, S&P name. And we just found that people at home were not as diligent. They weren't reckless. They just weren't as diligent. So there were things that we actually chose to rein in, personal trading issues, things like that. It just doesn't work as well. People do a great job, but it's a different mindset. I think the other thing that we sort of thought about too is with RFPs and DDQs, we've been super careful because our answer last May, now it's not misleading, it's not material, but what we were saying in May, we weren't saying at Labor Day, and at Christmas, we thought something different. And today, mid-March, a year in, we still, I see those answers as more fluid. Your ADV is what it is. But if you're answering a DDQ about, or, 15C about how many people are in the office and things like that, it's incredibly fluid.
Have any of you seen a rise in the number of trading errors with people working remotely?
That isn't anything that we experienced in our firm, and I'm going to knock wood so I don't jinx things. It seems to have been, even with the market volatility, concurrent with the time where we were transitioning to sort of the virtual work environment, that worked effectively. So fortunately, that wasn't the case for our firm.
Yeah. We've seen a slight uptick. What we saw more was client behavior changing due to volatility. We are largely managing individuals, endowments, what describe it as people. We're managing people. And when things started to really become incredibly volatile, particularly the early stages, let's say first 4 to 6 weeks, we didn't have more errors, but we had a lot of unique discussions regarding what are next steps. I think institutions are a little more steady. They have a longer time frame. But if you have an individual, they are a different mindset, a different time frame, and a market that's suddenly down 25 or 30% can cause them to make some moves that are probably detrimental to them. And we try to have discussions regarding those issues.
So we have a follow-up question on the PPP loan disclosure. So if you would disclose that you took out a loan last year in your ADV and have since had that loan forgiven, the question is, do you now have to disclose this year in your ADV the fact that it has been forgiven? And Jen, I know you can't give legal advice, but any thoughts on that scenario?
Well, I mean, at a minimum, you'd have to update your disclosure, right, during your annual update. And then I think it's just a determination to be made whether you retain anything in there about the PPP loan or not.
Okay. And one more question for now. Do you see an environment where a singular office now has a hybrid format where people can work from anywhere? For example, you might have a single IA in New York, but now you have employees working from all over the country in different states. How does that, like a spreading out of employees, impact the role of compliance?
Yeah, I think I'll jump in first. I mean, from our firm's perspective, and again, this is from a larger firm where we're relying on a lot of our sort of compliance monitoring and oversight is conducted using a variety of different tools. From that perspective, we're lucky to be able to sort of pull in the information that we need for doing that monitoring generally. But I do think that depending on who the individuals are and, the nature of the firm, that could definitely affect the compliance program and potentially licensing and regulate of the employees and things along those lines. So I don't know if my other panelists have any comments.
We've had similar concerns, and that is a new thing because employees are very, very interested in that. So yeah, we'll be disclosing more in the ADV about working remote. We also are dealing with some state law issues. Texas is a unique state, so things we did not have to contemplate before. If you had a presence in a state, you did that volitionally, as opposed to I have one person that wants to move to Austin. How does that impact us? What are the HR issues connected to that? There's big pictures and little picture issues. So no, it's a definite concern, but it's coming in my mind. It is going to happen as we come back.
I would just add, I agree with everything that was just said. I think there is an issue about the physical location, and do you now have an office in a state where you didn't previously? And as Chris and Lee said, what are the implications of that from a tax perspective, from an employment law perspective, from a state licensing and registration perspective, from how you disclose your office locations on your Form ADV? I think advisors are thinking through all of those issues. But I think the other side of this is, with respect to how you supervise, either from a compliance perspective or just a supervision perspective, remote offices. Clearly it's always better to have a face-to-face interaction, but I think that as an industry, we need to move away from this concept that we can't supervise people effectively unless we're in the same room as them. Because in today's world, with all of the data-driven supervision and all the tools that I think our compliance folks use and our supervisors use, very frequently you can get a better sense of what someone's doing by looking at the electronic footprint and the electronic interactions than if you were sitting next to them.
I think that's a good point.
Yeah, go ahead.
The one interesting thing that goes with that, I think we can complete all of our core function oversights. That can be done electronically. It's the culture. You raise a good point. The face-to-face doesn't necessarily tell you, I can get records and see what a person is trading or their activity or things like that. But there's the cultural issue of knowing these people and building trust and having them ask you questions and reach out to you, as opposed to just, I'm looking at your personal trading records. I'm looking at best execution. I'm looking at soft dollars. I'm looking at these. That gets you halfway there, maybe 3/4 of the way there, but it doesn't get to that cultural issue of knowing your people.
So what are some things you can do to have that outreach to people in other offices, or I guess everyone's in other offices at this point?
Yeah, that's something that we have, and Chris, it sounds like similar to your firm, where you've got different office locations. The people that are part of our firm are spread out over a variety of different office locations, including people on my team. So obviously it's just more so nowadays. But I think you had talked about, Chris, about the critical importance of, communication. And, what I would think of before is maybe over communicating, making sure that people, including people on your team, because I think people feel, at least initially, pretty isolated. It's a different situation when, you work in an office and your colleagues sit next to you, and to be able to just, turn in your chair and ask someone a question. We work in a very sort of gray area, and I want people on my team, as well as business people, to think about issues and know that there's sort of a virtual open door policy, and that we have that sort of partnership with between compliance and the business. And I think, you had talked about just reaching out, over communicating, trying to have training, sending out compliance advisories, joining business meetings so that people, see you and are thinking about compliance issues, because I don't think anybody's policies and procedures could address every situation, especially the situations that we encountered last year. And you want people to, think about how the policies and procedures do apply or should apply, but reach out with any questions that they have about sort of the novel issues that came up and continue to come up.
Yeah. And I think, at least for us, frequency has been as important as depth. People are not going to sit and talk about custody for an hour within the business, they're not going to pay attention. But I think if you constantly stay on their radar regarding these particular issues, we have lots of 15-minute catch-up meetings. Part of it is, again, just we're here, we have a role, we need to do this. It keeps their attention, because I found, you go an hour on a particular subject, you're getting people that aren't as focused. And particularly they're at home. Again, it's a different environment. So we tried to be frequent more than, incredibly in-depth discussions.
Any thoughts on the special case of onboarding a brand new employee in this environment? Chris, have you experienced this?
I have both in the sense of hiring for my team, but also being involved in the hiring for the firm. And I just can't describe that. A year ago at the conference, would you have contemplated hiring 5 or 6 people, not me specifically, but the firm, and never meeting them in person? Never having a cup of coffee with them, never. And then they have never stepped foot in the office. Right. It's just, to me, that one I just find amazing. I think it does require a different interview style. We've tried to have them meet with many more people, well outside their function area, get to know the person, because, as helpful Zoom, can be, it's not, in my mind, it's not the same. So we've gone from, 3 or 4 people that are directly involved with, let's say, this person's function, to ramping it up to 7, 8, 10 people, even if they're quick hits, 15 minutes, a half hour, to try to get the cultural feel. Does that person fit? Do they have the mindset for what we happen to do, or, another firm does? Because, I find it entirely fascinating, these people that, I've never seen in person.
You mentioned Zoom, Chris. So let's talk a little bit about how COVID has impacted communications, both within your firm with colleagues and with clients. I think we're all now more familiar with Zoom and Microsoft Teams and WebEx than we ever thought we'd be. So how's the long-term remote nature of the work affected the way you communicate?
It's more formal. It's people take Zoom much, more seriously. There isn't any upfront discussion, so there's less of that. I think Zoom, and similar to what I was saying about we were getting the basic functions done. I think, in my personal opinion, Zoom does what is necessary. It allows you to communicate. I think we get better at it all the time. I still don't think it's a replacement for, in-person, face-to-face discussions. It may eventually become that, or may become dominant. In that area, we may be 75% remote at some point in the future. I still just don't, it gets there to do the basics. I don't see it as fulfilling what we need to do sometimes.
How about you, Lee?
I agree with Chris's comments. I do think it's helpful, though, to be able to see people, to see their facial expressions, and feel more connected with people has definitely helped versus just a conference call. So I do think that technology has been helpful from that standpoint, and being able to just press a button and connect with people very fluidly has been really helpful. So I think that we all sort of miss seeing our coworkers and business partners in person. And hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll be able to spend time together in person. But I think it's worked out pretty well from my perspective.
And Jen, have you had any clients struggling with transitioning to e-delivery or any other communications issues?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the sort of silver linings, hopefully, of COVID is going to be that we're all going to feel more comfortable, and hopefully the regulators will feel more comfortable giving us guidance that's more up to date on electronic communications, on electronic delivery. I mean, one thing we haven't really talked about yet, I think, is how we interact with clients through the electronic.
I think Jen froze up. Yeah, speaking of communications, I mean, what about maybe older clients that are not as tech savvy? Has that been an issue, communicating with them, having meetings with them virtually?
That's been an issue for us. Again, we're largely individuals, many who have been clients for 40 or 50 years, these long family relationships. And yeah, you have situations where we've had situations where actually they're like, we want to meet in person. We sort of insist on it. And we've had people meet in their homes and, neutral locations. Yes, it's a generational issue that, they're not as comfortable with Zoom. They're not as comfortable with electronic communications, email, period. So, I mean, I think that is an issue that will fade generationally, but it's been a concern for us for sure.
Chris, do you still have clients who want the paper documents, and have you been able to accommodate that?
We have, with certain exceptions, but we are aggressively pushing away from that just because of privacy issues. And just, every time a piece of paper goes out, it worries me. Literally a physical piece of paper, it's a concern. So we know we have to move to a paperless world. In fact, I was going to talk about that later. It's going to have to happen. It's just how fast it happens. But no, we have people that I want to see my account statements and, my quarterly review. Some of them want it in person and, on paper.
So I see Jen is back. Jen, sorry we lost you. Did you have anything else to add?
I'm not sure exactly where I got off, so I think we should just go on.
We do have a question that I think is good for you, Jen. If having a one-on-one client meeting via Zoom, does that have to be recorded just as you would keep records of an in-person meeting?
No, I don't think there's any requirement that it be recorded. Certainly the fact that you had the meeting should be recorded, as it typically would be regardless of the medium. But I don't think the fact that we're having it via Zoom means that it needs to be recorded or retained from a record keeping perspective.
Okay. Chris or Lee, any further thoughts on communications?
Not from my perspective. The institutional clients, I think, are a little bit different. I've been on quite a number of client meetings, and sometimes there's a preference in terms of the client's media that they want to use, Zoom or Teams or WebEx, etc. But they've gone well from my perspective, and they seem very, very similar than they would in an in-person meeting. But I know people on the other side, the clients, do express, dissatisfaction. They would prefer to be in person, in particular when clients are used to, for example, seeing your offices and seeing, for example, the trading desk and things along those lines. Obviously, that's harder to accommodate virtually.
Okay, so I'd like to switch gears now. We've already touched on remote supervision a bit, but let's talk a little bit more about how not having a physical presence has impacted how compliance officers supervise and monitor both remote colleagues as well as your vendors, your supervisors. Chris, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, when we realized in about June that, this was going to be a long, 6-9 months, a year, we set up formal oversight of the offices. Instead of doing an annual, we were doing a quarterly meeting and a quarterly records search, sort of a mock audit of the offices. So we had to create structure. It was the same function we would have done, but we just felt we had to do it in a more timely fashion.
How about you, Jen?
I guess that the focus on, was the question with respect to remote supervision generally?
Yeah, just what impact has this had on your clients, and any tips you have that you've seen?
Yeah, I think that most firms, similar to what Chris was saying about developing a construct or a framework for it, have really been focused on coming up with a plan for how they can interact with employees who are in remote locations, and to do so on a fairly regular basis to maintain the relationship, but also to have a sense of what they're doing, and have some sort of a control environment around that.
And Jen, keep sticking with you. What about exams? How has that gone remotely?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. OC has said that they have been remote, and we heard Pete talking earlier about the fact that they expect that having sort of remote examinations will be part of the norm going forward, and will be a more substantial portion of the exams that they're conducting. Certainly we haven't seen any on-site examinations during COVID, nor would we have expected to, and that creates some efficiencies in terms of not having to travel and accommodate having the staff come into the office. But it also creates some challenges in terms of making sure that the communication with the staff is clear, and that they understand sort of how you're responding to requests, many of which are just, written requests back and forth. And I think we've counseled a lot of clients on the importance of picking up the phone and actually talking to the examiners during the course of the exam, just as you might if they were in your office, to clarify a point or convey something that might need to be, to have the benefit of an actual conversation rather than just the written correspondence. I would also say, the remote environment also affects the way the SEC is identifying issues, either for examination or for enforcement. I think they are increasingly relying on their sort of data-driven analytics. And we're seeing increasingly investment advisors receive requests for information either from OC or from the enforcement division that are based on sort of quantitative anomalies, like a large trade hits the SEC's screen and they decide to take further action. So in addition to sort of the routine examinations and sweep examinations, we're now starting to see discrete quantitative issues that are impacting and are motivating an exam.
And I'll just point out that, Jen, the outline you put together for this conference that's in the conference materials touches on a lot of this. It includes the COVID risk alert that OC put out, and it also talks about some state licensing and registration issues to look out for. So encourage people to check that out. Before we leave this topic, Lee, did you want to comment on vendors or any challenges there?
Sure. And if I could just sort of reinforce the point that Chris was making earlier about doing sort of more frequent monitoring. I think that was really something that we took a similar approach. We also very early on sort of reassessed the risks to our firm based on sort of the virtual environment and also the market volatility at the time. So it sounds like we took sort of similar approaches, and but we accelerated the sort of we undertake an annual risk assessment of our firm. We we did that earlier on, right in the Mayish time frame, to identify, are there areas of higher risk now that we should be thinking about, so that we in particular made sure that our compliance program and our monitoring and oversight was really focused on those areas of higher risk. So just wanted to mention that point. In terms of vendor due diligence, I think what our focus was with respect to oversight of our various service providers is to take an expansive view of who our service providers were, beyond sort of those service providers that are sort of contemplated as part of the compliance program. Given our sort of increased reliance on technology, we had to sort of think more holistically, and we have taken a number of steps to early on make sure that we're oversighting those vendors appropriately, understanding how their business continuity plans function. We want to understand, to the extent that they are using vendors themselves that could have impacts to the services that they're providing. So sort of, going down another level or going deeper in terms of vendors and understanding their, again, their business continuity plans. So I think that there's been, as part of our sort of ordinary course oversight of our service providers and vendors, we have regular certifications, questionnaires, performance metrics, and things like that, but we've adjusted those to more explicitly cover sort of the business continuity type questions.
Great, thanks, Lee.
And we did something very similar in the sense that we have a vendor oversight committee. When things became apparent it was going to be very different, we looked at a list of the vendors that we considered vital. We're not big enough to reach out to everybody. We certainly can't look at vendor of vendors. That's impressive. But we really felt, okay, these 5 or 6 vendors are literally vital to us moving forward. So we proactively reached out to them with a survey, similar to what you were saying, Lee, making sure, and I think we knew the answer. We felt we should show that level of diligence. But we identified those that, if something went wrong, they collapsed, could we continue doing business? Do we have resiliency? Do we have backups? So we chose to be forward-looking where we could.
So let's talk about some positive consequences that we can identify from the pandemic. So what are some silver linings that you think will stick with the industry? Lee, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think that in my own sort of team, that we identified a lot of opportunities to be more efficient. I think there were sort of protocols that we had when we were in the office and people were, working together that, may not have been the most efficient, but they became very awkward and apparent when we went to a virtual work environment, and there really wasn't a value add. So we streamlined certain processes, maybe cut out a middleman or something like that. And I think that we're more efficient because of that. As I said earlier, a lot of the monitoring that we do relies on various tools and systems. Some of those tools worked really, really well, and others, worked well, but could have been more efficient. So we're taking an opportunity now with respect to the tools that may have been older, leveraging older technology, to either ourselves see, are there ways for us to have those tools work more efficiently for our business? Are there other tools that we should be looking at so that we can work more efficiently? Are there lessons that we learned sort of in one area that we can apply in another area? So I think greater efficiency absolutely is another sort of silver lining. from our perspective. I think, people have sort of a different mindset. I think we've talked about, being more nimble. I think that people now, having gone through the last year and having to pivot a number of different times, that people kind of have that much more so as part of their mindset as well. So those are some of the things from my perspective.
And Chris, what do you see?
Sure. Technology, absolutely. You know what I mean? It has forced us to look at what we do to be more efficient. We say it on the slide, be more nimble. Probably for me, issue number one, just things that shouldn't be done manually, and you've resisted over the years, and you just realize you absolutely have to find a technology solve for this. Doing more with less. You're going to have to do that. I think nimble is interesting in the sense of even with hiring and things like that, it's going to be a different world because you will not be tied geographically quite as much, So I think it'll be an interesting 1, 3, 5 years, but I think everyone will come out of this, stronger, faster, able to streamline things, but it'll be very different. There's no question.
Well, let's talk about what the future might look like. I know there are a lot of legal issues to consider. We got an audience question about any legal concerns people should be thinking about in terms of reopening the office, coming back. Jen, can you touch on some of those?
Yeah, of course, I'm happy to. I mean, I think that that there are a number of things to think through, and the first is sort of what is the reopening plan? What does that look like? It's not just a question of when firms may reopen their offices, but also when they open them, what type of work week are people going to be on? Are you going to limit the number of people who come into the office at any particular point? Is it going to be more staggered? Are we going to be in an environment where, so long as everyone has a vaccine, it's not an issue? I mean, all of those things about sort of what your plan is are things that need to be considered. And of course, that's dependent on a whole range of different factors, including the state and local reopening guidelines that most all jurisdictions have. And so that has to be considered and reviewed. The other thing is obviously the screening process and whether advisors will screen all employees before they enter the workplace, whether you're going to require that everyone be vaccinated, have an active COVID test, do temperature scanning, symptom exposures, all of those kinds of issues. And of course, when you're in the employment space, you have to be aware of the fact that one size does not fit all. And there may be employees who, for valid reasons, whether health or otherwise, are not comfortable coming back to the office. And so to the extent that a firm is going to continue to permit remote work, and I think that my sense is most all firms will in some iteration, I think that advisors need to look at what their HR policies are around remote work, and how that's defined and what that means and what the implications are. Certainly from a tax perspective, we alluded to this earlier, but there are many laws, including tax laws and including state registration and licensing requirements that are tied to a geographic location. And as the geographic location changes or expands, firms need to think about whether, in the tax case, they may be subject to taxation in a state where they didn't weren't previously subject to it, and also whether their employees are subject to licensing and registration. And I mean, that's an issue both going into COVID and also coming out of COVID. As we go back to the sort of having some sort of in-person environment, firms need to think about whether that's going to be an entirely in-person or whether it's going to be a hybrid. And if it's going to be a hybrid, then you're still going to have to deal with all of those sort of legal issues. And then I think the last thing is just travel. Investment advisors need to think about, like all companies, the implications of business travel. When that we start to re-engage with that, whether there may be quarantines or longer periods where people who are traveling need to stay in the location to which they're traveling or from which they're traveling in order to address some of the requirements around COVID. And what that means from an employment perspective is that additional days off, is that time period compensated, et cetera. And so we've tried to include a number of resources relating to these different issues in the outline to help people think through the impact of the changes to the business model from an HR and from an other legal perspective.
And from just a practical, logistical perspective, Lee, do you want to comment on what you're planning in terms of office configuration and staggered work schedules or anything of the sort?
I think at this time, all of those sort of variables are in discussion, but our firm has not come out with a policy on that. But I know that it's being considered at sort of a senior level, but there's just a lot that's very fluid. And as we've been talking about, the complexity of working and having office locations in so many different regions as well just adds to complexity. So it's a little bit TBD, but all of those issues are things that we're taking into consideration.
How about you, Chris? And can you also comment on whether you think offering remote working is a perk that you'll almost have to offer to retain and attract employees?
I would not even describe it as a perk. I would describe it as the new normal. You know what I mean? I don't think, particularly the younger generation, you're not going to hire a 25-year-old and be here from 8 to 5 every day. In my personal opinion, that's gone. I actually think the transition back will be equally as hard as the transition out. Because I think the transition out was pretty simple. There's a pandemic. Don't come in the office. Don't go to the grocery store. You know what I mean? It was very binary in my mind. It was, this is bad. Don't travel. Don't go to the office. It was jarring, but it was simple. It was direct. I actually think it's going to be like an incredible inflection point, not just for our businesses, but for all businesses, how we transition back in. I mean, there are so many issues with, vaccines, there's people that just don't believe in it. There's people that have, religious observations, things like, there's going to be so many unique challenges to this. So I actually think the way back in will be equally challenging, if not more. And as Lee said, it's fluid. Everything's fluid right now. I mean, we've had many plans that have been scuttled or pushed or tweaked. I think, I can say we have desire to be back by late summer in some shape or form. I don't ever see us being back to full offices. I could be wrong. I just don't see that ever completely returning. And I do think, there's lots of unique, I'd say a lot of this is HR issues. I was talking to an old colleague who I worked with for years, and coming into the office somewhat ill was almost, you're taking one for the team. You value this meeting so much that you would be a pariah if you showed up today coughing or, and we were laughing about that 10, 15, 20 years ago, what a team player, what a trooper. Now you would be, disenfranchised from the firm. So it's going to be a different mindset for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to first announce the second code word for CE credit. It is COVID followed by the number 2, no space. So it's just COVID 2. We did have a question going back to the, I guess, the registration and licensing. If someone does live elsewhere but does not put that address out as a place to meet clients, do they still need to worry about the registration issues, Jen?
They do, unfortunately. I mean, the concept of a place of business for purposes of the state licensing and registration really turns on not just a location that's held out to the public as a location where you conduct advisory services, but also any office where the investment advisor representative regularly provides advisory services. And so that's why I think so many firms have struggled with the state licensing and registration issue, because it's pretty common to have employees who live in one state and work in another state. They historically were only registered where they worked, but now that their office location has essentially shifted to their home or to some other location, then that becomes a place of business, and that potentially triggers state licensing and registration requirements.
Great, thanks. Well, why don't we end by just sharing any final thoughts, anything you'd like to emphasize or that we didn't get to? Lee, do you want to start us?
I guess one other point that I would make, and I might have said it before, I think a lot of people have sort of fiscal year ends of 12/30, so it's a great time, as we talked about earlier, to look at your policies and procedures and your Form ADV disclosure, and make adjustments to reflect changes in practices that you may have made in the last year or so. So I think that that's a good timely reminder, and I agree with Chris's point about sort of return to the office. I think it's going to be very, very complicated for the reasons he and Jen were mentioning. So I think it will continue to be an interesting time to work in compliance 2021.
And you, Chris?
Yeah, I think Lee's point about record keeping, it is a time, even though you probably don't have a ton of time, to look at policies and procedures, because it's just inevitable that we will have material changes. We will have things that we might not even really focus on that are just different, plain and simple. So we're looking to do an up and down review of the ADV policies, procedures, code of ethics. I mean, privacy is a huge issue. You have client information on your desk at your home. There's a myriad of issues. I'll just use privacy as the example. You should be disclosing that more clearly. Your portfolio manager might be sitting in his office in his suburban home transacting on your behalf. I'm not even focused on the regulatory. I'm just focused on the way we describe it to clients, in our disclosure documents.
Jen, you get the final word.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are both really good thoughts. I encourage firms to embrace the fact that we are at an inflection point, and for better or worse, COVID has created a way to sort of look at business before and after, and to use that as an opportunity to revisit things that perhaps weren't working as efficiently as they could, or that need to be modernized and enhanced. As both I think Chris and Lee have said, as you conduct those reviews and think about the impact on your business, certainly make sure that aligns with your disclosures and with your written policies and procedures, and with your internal desk procedures. So the good news is we're coming out of the pandemic. The bad news is we continue to have a lot of work to do as a result of it.
So we've come to the end of our time. So I'd like to thank Lee Faria, Chris Hayes, and Jen Class for an excellent discussion. Those of you who are IAA members, you're welcome to join our calls every other Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, where we discuss COVID-19 issues, and we'll continue to have those calls to help members through as the situation evolves. And and that hopefully eventually comes to an end.